Hello, friends. The lunar module of the Apollo 11 mission touched down on the moon on July 20th, 1969. Among them were Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. Once they were on the moon, Neil Armstrong tried to open the door so they could go down. High pressure made it hard to open this door, but he was able to do it after a little trouble. Then he put on his heavy spacesuit and tried to get to the moon. He hit the top by accident because the exit wasn't very big, and a piece of the lunar module broke off. Because there wasn't enough air, neither of them knew this. The sound didn't go anywhere. They didn't hear anything. But this broken part was very important. It was the switch that turns on the Assent Engine. Their lunar module couldn't take off again, and they couldn't get back to Earth without this switch. He didn't know this when he got out of the spaceship and walked on the moon's surface. He was the first person to walk on the moon.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
However, did it really happen? Even though it's been more than 50 years, many people still don't think that people went to the moon. Some people come up with their own ideas to say that the whole Apollo 11 mission was a fake that America put on. They lied to everyone and shot the scenes on Earth. What else could explain the flag flapping when there is no wind? What does the truth say? Let's watch this video and try to understand what it's about.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Houston, we see you on a stereo, over.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Friends, it might surprise you to learn that the real reason Apollo 11 was planned was to start a war. To be more specific, the Cold War. United States and the USSR were at odds with each other. There was a space race between the two countries. Since 1957, the Soviet Union has been the first country to launch a man-made satellite. It was called Sputnik, and it was the first thing that people put into orbit around the Earth. The US government was shocked to see the USSR pulling ahead. After a few months in 1958, the United States also launched a satellite. After 3 years, in 1961, America got another shock. His name was Yuri Gagarin, and he was the first person to go to space. Once more, the Soviets beat the United States. After 1 week, on April 20th, 1961, John F. Kennedy, who was President of the United States at the time, sent a letter to the Vice President. He asked the Vice President what they could do to beat the USSR, putting a lab in space or taking a trip around the moon, etc. Are we working 24 hours a day on existing programs? If not, why not? Are we putting in the most effort? They were asking if there was another space program that could be done quickly, would have big effects, and put them ahead of the competition. Following a few days, he found out the answer. Sending people to the moon would be the next big thing. In his famous speech on May 25th, 1961, he told everyone that he would send people to the moon by the end of the decade. Besides this, he also promised to safely bring people back to Earth.
Before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
A lot of people thought this was an amazing news. Friends, let's go back to 1961. There were no internet and not even GPS. In those days, computers were very slow and old, but he promised to send people to the moon. For this reason, he gave the space program an extra $7 billion to $9 billion over the next 5 years. The space agency as a whole was working toward this one goal. After only a few months, the tests started. To begin, they checked out the rockets that would take them away from Earth. After that, the command unit's heat screens were checked, how well they could stand up to heat. Then the service module systems for moving it forward. From 1963 to 1967, a lot of tests were done without people being there. During the tests, the rockets did not carry any people. The first test with people on board in February 1967. For the test, people will be sent into space on rockets. In this case, it was Apollo 1. But on January 27, 1967, while the tests were going on Earth, the cabin caught fire, killing the 3 men who were getting ready to go to space. NASA didn't give up after this terrible event. In its place, it kept trying more. Missions Apollo 4, 5, and 6 were all done without any people on board, to do more tests. With the launch of Apollo 7 in October 1968, they tried to send people into space once more. This worked out well. In just 2 months, in December 1968, the Apollo 8 mission took 3 men close to the moon. In March 1969, 3 months after that, the Apollo 9 mission took off. The moon module was put to the test in this, that part of the spaceship that was going to land on the moon. It was May 1969, 2 months after that, when Apollo 10 took off. It was practice for 3 men to do almost everything that they were meant to do on the Apollo 11 mission, except land on the moon. Take a look at how fast NASA was sending out flights one after the other. Every 2 to 3 months, there is a new trying to test something new. There were tests of rockets, spaceships, and going to the moon. Finally, on July 16, 1969, the Apollo 11 mission was sent into space.
2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
There were 3 men on this trip. Neil Armstrong, a leader who is 38 years old, led this mission. Buzz Aldrin was in charge of flying the Lunar Module, and Michael Collins was in charge of flying the command module. There are records of these 3 names in the books of history. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin become well-known people whose names everyone knows today. You might not know this, but Michael Collins isn't very well known. I'll tell you why later in the film. There were 3 main parts to the spaceship that Apollo 11 used. There is the Lunar Module, the Service Module, and the Command Module. The first 2 together are called CSM. The plan was for the Lunar Module to be taken off and rest on the moon. The Lunar Module would have to be launched again and connected to the CSM so that the men could get back to Earth. A Saturn V rocket was going to be used to send this spaceship into space. Before it took off, the rocket was filled with 1 million gallons of kerosene, oxygen, and hydrogen. This rocket weighed 3 million kilograms. With its help, the spaceship got into orbit around the Earth. It didn't take long to get to the orbit. Then they went around the Earth about 1.5 times. After that, Mission Control, which was based on Earth, gave them permission to start translunar injection. Getting the spaceship out of Earth's orbit and into Moon's orbit, the Saturn V rocket was used to get out of Earth's orbit. The rocket's 3rd stage was this. These things happened less than 5 hours after the start, but it took several days to get to the moon. While waiting in the spacecraft, the astronauts ate, slept, and took pictures of themselves and their surroundings. On July 19, 1969, after traveling almost 400,000 kilometers, the Apollo 11 spaceship reached orbit around the moon. It was meant to be split into 2 here. The Lunar Module and the Command and Service Module broke apart. In the Command Module, Michael Collins was. This part of the spaceship was called Columbia. The Lunar Module was also known as the Eagle. It had Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin in it. The Command and Service Module was supposed to stay in orbit around the moon. There would only be 1 capsule that would land on the moon. That means Michael Collins could not walk on the moon. Only Armstrong and Aldrin could. This could be why not many people know about Michael Collins. He was on the Apollo mission, but he didn't walk on the moon. Still, Michael Collins may have played the most important role in this mission, because the Lunar Module was meant to be joined to the CSM again. Armstrong and Aldrin could not have come back safely without Michael Collins. The Lunar Module was set to land on the moon around 8 p.m. At 8:10 p.m. the bells went off. 12:01 and 12:02 sounds.
1201. 1201. Roger, 1201 alarm.
Armstrong and Aldrin both didn't know what this warning meant. They asked Mission Control what they should do next. Mission Control tells them not to worry about it and keep going.
We're go. Same type. We're go.
They found out later that at 12:02 was a message. The Apollo navigation computer's processing system was too busy to handle the extra work. Thanks to smart engineering, the computer was built so that the mission-critical apps would keep running even when it was crowded. The program for automatic landing was put on the computer. The Lunar Module would then land itself on the moon's surface. But Neil Armstrong took over when they were 150 meters above the ground. It looked like the Lunar Module was going to land in a place with a lot of big rocks all over the place. At that point, the landing spot was changed, and they chose a different spot for the landing that was 4 miles away from where they were supposed to land. Buzz Aldrin looked at the fuel gauge at 8:16 p.m. There was only 5% fuel left.
100 feet, 3.5 down, 9 forward. 5%.
They started the countdown when they saw how little fuel was left. The timer is running out to decide if they should land or give up on the task.
Now we're critical fuel state, and that's why the 60-second call was given, and then the 30-second call.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility.
The Eagle had made it safely to land. Neil Armstrong then put on his spacesuit, opened the door, and walked out onto the moon.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now.
Nearly 650 million people watched this event on TV. The world watched his first words on TV.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Buzz Aldrin stayed with him on the moon's surface for another 2.5 hours, during which they took pictures, collected samples of the moon's dust and rocks, and set up a number of science tools. There is no doubt that the Cold War played a big role in the decision to land on the moon. But since the mission was already planned, it was clear that they brought science equipment with them. Several science goals were also part of this trip. They put up a TV camera on the moon so that it could send messages back to Earth. They brought a tool to study the solar winds that reach the moon, installed a machine that sends laser beams to Earth. The laser beams can be used to find the exact distance between Earth and the moon. They also had a seismometer that didn't work. To find out how strong the moon's shocks are, they also left an American flag behind, in a plate that said, "Here, men from the planet Earth first set foot on the moon, July 1969 AD. The Lunar Module had to stay on the moon for 21 hours. Then it had to take off again and attach to the CSM. But in order to go up, they needed power, which meant they needed an engine. Armstrong and Aldrin didn't realize that the switch to turn on the engine had broken while they were getting out. They found out what had happened when they got back to the Lunar Module. They told Mission Control about the damage and started looking for a way to fix it. They came up with an interesting solution. Buzz Aldrin realized that if the circuit was broken, they needed to find something that could be used to fix it. He looked around and saw his ballpoint pen. He used it to fix the circuit and start the engine again. Finally, the Lunar Module was attached to the CSM again, and the 3 astronauts turned the spacecraft back toward Earth. The plan for landing on Earth was for the command module and the service module to be split apart. The service module would then be destroyed by Earth's atmosphere, but there was a chance that if the service module was badly damaged, its pieces could fly into the command module and kill the astronauts inside. To keep this from happening, NASA put thrusters in the service module to move it away from the command module so that the two wouldn't crash into each other. But when the astronauts were coming back to Earth, they found that the thrusters on the service module weren't working. The 3 astronauts could only sit in the command module and watch as the service module broke apart around them. It was a miracle that the pieces didn't hit the command module, which is still safe. There was such a high chance that the astronauts would die on this mission that US President Nixon wrote an alternative speech in case they did. Can you imagine that speech? In it, he said, "Fate has decreed that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. Ernest Aldrin and Neil Armstrong, it are brave guys who know they will never get better. These 2 guys are giving up their lives for the most important cause in the world, the search for truth and understanding." Luckily, this wasn't needed. The command module safely descended through Earth's atmosphere, its parachutes deployed, and it landed in the ocean, where all 3 astronauts were still alive and safe. It was truly miraculous that they made it back alive. The mission hadn't gone exactly as planned. They had to deal with problems at almost every step. They were able to make it back alive. It's interesting to note that after they got back, the 3 astronauts were quarantined for 2 weeks. It was against the rules for them to be around other people because they might have brought viruses or bacteria from the moon that could cause problems on Earth. Luckily, nothing bad happened. The landing of Apollo 11 on the moon was the biggest story in newspapers around the world. It was part of President Kennedy's promise that humans would land on the moon by the end of the decade.
In 1969, the public had little reason to question mankind's historic first step on the moon. After all, the achievement was a celebration of technological supremacy. America had finally won the space race.
Isn't it strange that America reached the moon the year before, in 1969? To get an edge in the Cold War, they couldn't have planned a fake moon landing operation, could they? Their real mission to land on the moon failed, so they planned this fake mission as a backup for everyone to see. Friends, this is just one example of a conspiracy theory based on the moon landing. But friends, these theories have been debunked many times already. If this was an attempt by the US to trick the world, the Soviets would never have admitted it, but the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, which came out between 1970 and 1979 in its third edition, the Apollo landing was the third most important event in the history of the space age, after Sputnik's launch in 1957 and Yuri Gagarin's flight in 1961. The Soviet Union officially agreed with this. But what about the flag? Why was it flapping around on the moon where there is no air? There is a simple explanation for this, friends. The flag that Armstrong and Aldrin took to the moon was specially made. Usually flags have one long vertical rod, but this one had a horizontal rod right at the top so that the flag would always be stretched out. Because no wind would blow a flag on the moon, NASA decided to add a horizontal rod to the top so that the flag could always be seen. But on the Apollo 11 mission, there were problems extending this horizontal rod, so it couldn't be extended all the way to the end. This is what made the ripples in the flag, which is why people think it's fluttering. You can only see it fluttering in videos where astronauts are moving it. The aluminum rods in the flag were like springs, so the flag would move for a short time and then stay still. The third most popular theory says that the stars can't be seen in the pictures Armstrong and Aldrin took. The reason for this is very simple. The moon landing happened during the day. When sunlight hit the moon, astronauts' white spacesuits were very reflective. Back then, cameras didn't have the resolution to see past reflections. There is also a theory about the shadows and why they aren't all at the same angle. Some say that because it looked like a Hollywood movie, they didn't have a single source of light, which is why the shadows are all over the place. But in reality, the sun wasn't the only source of light. The moon's surface was also a source of light because it reflected so much of it. This is why the light went in all different directions and the shadows were so strange. Beyond these silly ideas, there was real criticism. Not everyone praised the moon landing and NASA's work. In January 1962, the New York Times reported that the money being spent to go to the moon could have been used to build at least 120 universities the size of Harvard. People asked if the money being spent on the moon landing should have been used to build a Harvard-style university in every U.S. state instead. They said there were better ways to spend that money because the country had so many problems, like education and income inequality, and was still dealing with the effects of the Vietnam War. So why was so much money being wasted on this? But there were many benefits to the moon landing that no one had even thought of, like the progress made in computer chips. In 1962, 3 years after they were invented, IBM decided that they wouldn't use microchips in their computers.
Here is a packaged integrated circuit. Inside this package is a chip of silicon which provides the electrical equivalent of many transistors, resistors, and diodes, all interconnected to provide the desired function.
But because NASA ordered so many integrated circuits, IBM started working on it. The price dropped by more than 90% over the next 5 years because of the high demand. This was done to see if computers could keep people safe. If astronauts could go to the moon and back using these chips, then we can use them in our everyday lives. Technology grew very quickly after this mission. However, Apollo 17 was the last mission to the moon, happening in December 1972. It has been almost 50 years since then, and no one else has been there. It took more than 400,000 engineers, scientists, and technicians to work on the Apollo program, which cost a total of $24 billion. That amount of money is now worth more than $100 billion. But by 1972, most people were no longer interested in NASA or the moon because the Vietnam War was still going on and people were having more problems. They thought the space program was a waste of money.
Thousands of demonstrators opposed to the Vietnam War assembled in the nation's capital for a mass protest.
NASA had planned missions up to Apollo 20, but politicians had to listen to the people and cut back on the money spent on space programs. In December 2017, former President Donald Trump said he would increase funding so that people could be sent back to the moon by 2024,
returning American astronauts to the moon for the first time since 1972 for long-term exploration and use this time.
But later he changed his mind and said NASA should focus on Mars instead of the moon. But now, 50 years later, NASA has made plans to send people to the moon again through their new Artemis program. But NASA wants to send the first woman to the moon by 2025 or 2026. One thing is for sure, people will be back on the moon by the end of this decade. If you like this video, you can watch more space-related videos by clicking on this playlist. The videos cover a lot of interesting topics. Let's meet in the next video. Thank you very much.